Good morning. The Harlem Renaissance happened in the 1920s when a lot of disenfranchised African Americans whose parents or grandparents or great-grands had been slaves and themselves were suffering from the shenanigans of the Jim Crow laws, the cruelty, the paranoia, the never-ending game, the rigged game, as Ralph Ellison refers to it in The Invisible Man, and in The King of the Bingo Game. They left. They left the South and they headed up to big metropolitan areas up north, Harlem being one of them in New York City. And during the 20s, it was a mecca. It was the epicenter of urban African American arts. It ended when the Depression started. Funding dried up when people went broke, when the stock market crashed in '29. But it was everything. I mean, it was everything from food to poetry to literature to drama to anthropology. Zora Neale Hurston walked around with a tape recorder recording accents, be they city accents or be they country accents, for the sake of posterity. The biggest guy, the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, is a man we're going to look at today, Langston Hughes. But first I want to do a poem by Cullen, who was another heavy hitter. He wasn't, let's put it this way, Langston Hughes, without it, it would have been a guy selling CDs out of the trunk of a car. But Langston Hughes made it a legitimate deal, a legitimate arts movement, not just a festival, but a movement in the sense that he was a mentor, he was a participant, he advertised, he critiqued, he funded as much as he could help. But County Cullen, and again, this is the poem. It's a sonnet. It's got some classical stuff in it. It's got 14 lines. It's got a rhyme scheme. It's got iambic pentameter. But it's filled with not only beautiful turns of phrase, but backhanded compliments. And it's about race. I mean, I think that goes without saying when you get to the end of this thing. I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, kind, and did he stoop to quibble could tell why the little buried mole continues blind, why flesh that mirrors him must someday die. So County Cullen is thinking about all these mysteries. God did all these things, but yet he made a mole who's never ever going to see. I mean, it's got eyes, but they don't work. Why man, who's in the image of God, has to die. He's questioning all these things in this first stanza, and he continues into the second. I'm going to pause for a second here. Minor technical difficulty. So, County Cullen's Yet Do I Marvel, we were talking about it before we got interrupted. He's marveling at the mysteries of why God does what he does. In fact, look at the first line. I didn't mention it. I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, and kind. And did he stoop to quibble could tell why. Like, if God could, take some time out of his busy schedule, I'm sure he's really nice, but maybe he would tell me these things that almost seem like torture in a way. The next lines, the next stanza, make plain the reason tortured Tantalus is baited by the fickle fruit. Declare if merely brute caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair. Those are two guys from Greek mythology who committed the sin, the crime of hubris, and are tortured in the Greek hell, in Hades, for eternity. Tantalus, always on the verge of starving to death, and just as this beautiful food reaches down from a branch right into his grasp, the branch pulls it back out, and he's just tantalized by being this close from taking care of his hunger and his thirst. Now, Sisyphus, I don't remember what he did, but he's the guy that pushes that boulder up the cliff, and he gets all the way to the top and then has to push it all the way back down again. And they're being tortured. But understand something, this is not the Christian God. This is Zeus and the Olympians who have committed Tantalus and Sisyphus to pay for their hubris. By the way, hubris is the biggest crime in Greek mythology, next to not being nice to your neighbors. I mean, Zeus and Hera would dress up as beggars and wander about. And if somebody did something nice for them, they were granted an olive tree, bounty came their way. But if they were like, get the hell off my porch, they suffered. Their house burned down, their kids died. But back to the sonnet by County Cullen. So why does a mole continue blind even though it's got eyes? Why does man have to die even though it looks like God? And why does Tantalus and Sisyphus have to be tortured every single day of their lives for eternity? Inscrutable his ways are, and immune to catechism by a mind too strewn with petty cares to slightly understand. What awful brain compels his awful hand? Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. So, inscrutable, meaning untouchable. He's immune to any sort of catechism. And I've often wondered, too, the mind too strewn with petty cares. God's mind, because he's worrying about every little detail, every earthquake, every tornado, every flood, every plague. Or man's mind, because he's got stupid little things like surviving and not getting eaten by dinosaurs and inventing fire to think about. But I do know this. I do know there's a duality to the word awful. What awful brain compels his awful hand? Of course it means filled with awe, but it also means awful as in terrible. Again, a backhanded compliment. And the biggest thing, the thing he ends with in his couplet at the end, yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. There's two thoughts on this. I have two thoughts on this. One, it's 1920 something. I'm a black poet. I write this beautiful poem. No one's going to read it because I'm a black poet. Why did you even give me the talent to do it? Or I've had this legacy in this country, 400 years, 350 years of absolute trauma. Why would you make me sing a happy song? Why would you make me sing like a bird, despite the fact that I've been caged since day one? That's the biggest mystery to him. That's the one that affects him most personally, because he is the black poet. Now, I mentioned earlier the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, Mr. Langston Hughes. As it turns out, the first poem by Langston Hughes that we're going to do is The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Now, giving you a test, it would be really easy to identify this poem on a test, because every single word, every single line in this poem has either the word river or the mention of a river in it. And Langston Hughes wrote this when he was a young man. He was traveling over the Mississippi. He was 19 maybe even 18 still. And he was looking down at the mighty Mississippi, which, understand, in its day, even still today, it's one of the most important geographical landmarks in this country. It divides the uptight landed gentry on the East Coast with the hooligans and the 49ers on the West Coast back in Mark Twain's day. But, I mean, it's such a diverse river. I mean, there's parts where you can stand in your up to your ankles fly fishing. There's other parts where you can't see the shore and you're up in a tuna tower fishing from a giant boat. It varies from a ditch to the Big Muddy, to a roaring river. But every single group of people that Langston Hughes mentions in this poem live on a river. Because without a river, you've got absolutely nothing. Without a river, you've got no civilization. I mean, that's why Charleston was such an affluent and important and culturally rich city, because it was on the meeting place of the Ashley and the Coopers. So, I think he's doing sort of a transmigration of souls. If you get a chance, listen to the song The Highwayman if you don't know it. It's Waylon Jennings, Chris Christopherson, Willie Nelson, and Johnny Cash. And each singer takes a different verse about being a highwayman. Willie starts out, I was a highwayman, and his soul, when he gets killed, goes into the next guy. So it's that same soul in a different adventurer's body, more or less. And I think the thing that combines, or connects rather, all the people that Langston Hughes talks about that live on the banks of these rivers, slaves. I think people who are enslaved. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins. That's how important it is. It's like the circulatory system in the human body. Without it, you're immediately dead. That's how important rivers are to civilization. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. And you'll notice he kind of bookmarks this poem. The beginning and the end are nearly identical. Not the exact same, but they're nearly identical. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. So, Euphrates, modern day Iraq, the Mesopotamian crescent, the Congo, runs right up the gut of Africa, and, the young men that were captured by other chieftains and sold into slavery by their own people, he's there. He's there on the Euphrates as these conquering nations sort of wander into the Fertile Crescent. He's on the Nile, and it certainly wasn't aliens that built the pyramids. It was slaves from all over the place, from everywhere that the Egyptians conquered. And Mississippi, when he's talking about the Mississippi, if Abe Lincoln's there, it's before the Civil War. Lincoln didn't leave the greater Virginia area during the Civil War, so he's campaigning, meaning slavery is still intact. So I think that's the connection with all the soul that he mentions twice in this thing. The soul of a slave on a river, because that's where slaves go. That's where the cotton grows. That's where the rice is shipped out. That's where the indigo is planted and shipped to England. That's where the pyramids are built. It's near this. It's the hub. With civilization comes slavery in the context of history. Now, as almost epic and classical as that poem sounds, when you look at I Too by Langston Hughes, you'll see, let me see here, you'll also see kind of a different voice. That, like the Mississippi, that's how diverse Langston Hughes' voice is. He can be, I don't know, an old lady and mother to son. He can be an old weary man, a blues singer from the Weary Blues. And I Too, it's almost like it's a rebuttal. Do you remember the term apostrophe? I mentioned it with John Donne the other day. It's when you speak to something that can't be spoken. Walt Whitman did that a lot. He would say like, "Oh moon," and then have this like 17-page poem about the moon. Well, in Song of Myself, Walt Whitman talks or sings about everything. From the rich man in the penthouse suite overlooking Central Park to the bum in his own stool wandering around in the Bowery. But I think he kind of gave short shrift to the black man. And I think even though Walt Whitman sang America, I think this is Langston Hughes saying, you forgot somebody. I too sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Not I too am American, but America, part of the fabric. The whole thing about eating in the kitchen, it's like a second-class citizen. And it ties in not only to, I guess, some of the more servile jobs on the plantation, but it also kind of ties in, too, to like little kids eating at a card table during the holidays, Thanksgiving. They don't get to sit with the adults. It's also, you've heard the expression, what does he bring to the table as far as business goes? You're going to hire somebody that can bring something to the table. But they make him sit, and I think it kind of also goes back, if I didn't make this clear, to some of the segregation that went on in places like the Woolworth Diner. The big one, especially the most famous one in Greensboro, North Carolina. It was the site of one of the first peaceful protests during the civil rights movement. But as it turns out, that metaphor of the kitchen and the table, he bides his time. Tomorrow, and I don't think he means 24 hours from now, but in a generation or 2 or 3, I'll be at the table when company comes. And nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen. Plus, they'll be ashamed. They'll be ashamed of Jim Crow. They'll be ashamed of slavery. The whole legacy will be a dark cloud. that nobody wants to talk about. But I will be at the table with the adults, so to speak. I won't be at the little kids' table. I don't know. It's a beautiful poem, especially when you think about it being a hand up to Walt Whitman and kind of forcing himself in there as, hey, without us, none of the other stuff you mentioned would exist. So, Raisin in the Sun, the play, took its name from a line in Harlem, A Dream Deferred, also by Langston Hughes. I mean, you think about this too. The Harlem Renaissance was beautiful. I mean, you can see Langston Hughes, and you'll see the picture of him on D2L looking out the window and saying, this is it. This is as good as it gets right now. And then you see an older Langston Hughes in his 40s or 50s, early 60s, looking out at Harlem and seeing junkies and graffiti and litter and being like, where'd it go? I think the dream that, it wasn't deferred, but it got canceled more or less by the Depression, was the Harlem Renaissance. I always feel like that's in the back of his head when he wrote this poem. And of course, from reading Raisin in the Sun, that deferred means delayed. I had a student loan that I deferred for years and years, and now it's quadruple what it should be. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like a rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? You'll notice every single thing that the dream does, if you don't act on it, it's destroyed. It's destroyed in some fashion, whether it's an explosion, a rot, a fester, nothing good. I mean, one of the quiz questions, does it grow like a weed? That would even be too positive for the dream to grow, even if it was like a weed and not a fruiting plant. But it's a Carpe Diem poem. It's the second, probably after the second section of Yet Do I Marvel, Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, probably one of the most famous Carpe Diem poems we'll look at here. Because, you saw what happened to the Younger family in Raisin in the Sun. They bickered, they waited, and everybody's dream got kind of screwed up a little bit because they didn't have anything going. They didn't have the right connections. They weren't on the same page, to use a massive cliche from the boardroom. But anyway, as it turns out, you'll notice 3 different poems by the master, by the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, and they all kind of sound different. But this one, not written in the 20s, written in the 50s, I believe, early 60s perhaps. He's just looking back, and he's thinking about what was. I don't know. The Harlem Renaissance is a topic you could use if you're interested for the the poetry anthology. If you decide to do poetry from the Renaissance, you can only use somebody like Hughes twice. You can't use the same poet more than 2 times. But there's so many poets out there. I mean, just go to poetryfoundation.org and look up Harlem Renaissance poems. Look up in our textbook, if you happen to own it, there's a whole section on there. If you need some help finding some good poets from the Renaissance, let me know. I'll be glad to help you out. But I'm going to do a whole spiel on the poetry anthology, and we'll have a question and answer, and I'll actually call you if need be on the phone if you give me your number, and we'll make it happen. Thanks.